For my part, whatever anguish of spirit it may cost, I am willing to know the whole truth, to know the worst, and to provide for it. Patrick Henry.
Oh, hi. Mr. Lahasky here. And today, we're going to turn the Boston Harbor into the world's most controversial cup of tea. It's time to start a revolution. Last time, we looked at the long-term causes of the American independence movement, those underlying factors that would come to the surface as the movement intensified. They included the Enlightenment, the Great Awakening, salutary neglect, and the aftermath of the French and Indian War. Today, we'll look at the proximate causes, or short-term triggers, of the War for Independence. Now, while the long-term causes were fairly easy to list and explain, this lecture will feel a little different. The events that led up to the revolution can't really be examined in a vacuum. Instead, this will unfold like toppling dominoes. One gets pushed over, leading to another, and another, and another. And once the chain reaction starts, it's difficult to stop. Another way you can think about this is a long ping pong or tennis rally. Each player has to cater his or her next shot based on the shot of their opponent. In this way, both are constantly responding to one another, and the game becomes more intense with each volley. But enough metaphors for now. Let's get into the nitty-gritty. But first, a big question. Was violence the key to the American independence movement? Violence in protests have been a hot-button issue in recent years, and a great deal of rhetoric has been thrown around by politicians and the news media about the merits of violent versus nonviolent protests. But what does America's history say about this relationship? Obviously, once the war began, violence was the most obvious way to end it. But violence and destruction also played a role in the movement before the war. We'll learn today about the Sons of Liberty, the circumstances around the Boston Massacre, and the Boston Tea Party, all of which were chastised by the British and American loyalists as barbaric and inappropriate methods of protest. But were these actions peripheral to the movement as a whole, or were they the key ingredient to its success? Let's take a look. Our big ideas today will set the stage for each series of volleys between the British and the American colonists. Here's the first. The aftermath of the French and Indian War forced the British to end salutary neglect and look for ways to decrease their expenses and raise revenues in the colonies. Remember, the 7 years or French and Indian War left the British Empire facing hard economic times. Their budget problems forced them to look for ways to save money and make money. Salutary neglect had led to unrealized economic potential in the colonies, so the Brits turned their attention there first. The terms of the Treaty of Paris in 1763 had awarded the British control of the Ohio River Valley, so colonists quickly began moving into the new territory. But Native Americans in the region who had been left out of the peace treaty resisted this encroachment. Pontiac's rebellion gave the colonists trouble, so much so that the British Crown was forced to leave British soldiers in North America to protect its settlers. But this was expensive, and Britain was trying to reduce its spending. So the king issued the Proclamation of 1763. The law created the Proclamation Line, which ran along the ridge of the Appalachian mountain range, from Maine to Georgia. The king forbade any British colonists from living to the west of this line. The idea was to use the mountains as a natural barrier between hostile Native Americans and the British colonists. This would allow the British government to recall the troops stationed on the frontier and save some money. The Proclamation Line of 1763 witnessed a backlash in the colonies for several reasons. First, the colonists were not crazy about being told where they could or could not live by the British government. This was an autonomy that they had always enjoyed during salutary neglect. Second, the colonists had just fought a decade-long war against the French in order to gain the land that was now forbidden to them. Third, many colonists were already living to the west of the Proclamation Line. When soldiers were withdrawn, these colonists were exposed to conflict with American Indians, and their government was essentially refusing to protect them. The proclamation largely did not result in calls for independence, but colonists began expressing their displeasure with the British government, and many ignored the law. But Britain also needed to raise revenues. Bringing home the troops was not nearly enough to solve their financial woes. So in 1764, the British government passed the Sugar Act, which placed a tax on sugar products imported to the colonies. This was actually pretty similar to the Molasses Act of a few decades prior, except this one was much better enforced. The tax was an indirect tax, collected from the merchant, but many merchants tried to avoid it by smuggling around tax collectors, and some became quite good at this. So the British looked for other ways to reestablish mercantilism and generate revenue from the colonies. So in 1764, they also passed the Currency Act. The Currency Act placed tight regulations on paper money in the colonies, essentially forbidding the colonies from using their own. The intent of the law was to protect British merchants from being paid with less valuable colonial money. But it created a financial hardship in the colonies. Most ignored the provision altogether and continued to operate using colonial currency. These early acts, the Proclamation Line, the Sugar Act, and the Currency Act, were fairly benign. They did not spark major protests, but nor were they particularly effective. But by 1765, the British changed their strategy. This is outlined in our second big idea. After early efforts failed to rein in the colonies and spur economic recovery, the British turned to more direct methods, eventually sparking protests and outrage in the colonies. The British government was only beginning to recognize the effects of a century of salutary neglect when they touched off a proverbial powder keg with the passing of the Stamp Act in 1765. Now, let me be clear about something. The Stamp Act was not a tax on stamps. It was a tax on paper products. Per the new law, any paper product purchased in the colonies, newspapers, pamphlets, certificates, licenses, receipts, and more, had to be stamped with an official seal before the sale was considered legal. In order to receive the stamp, the buyer had to pay a tax. Unlike today, the world in the 18th century ran on paper. So this tax affected nearly everyone, and it engendered lots of opposition in the colonies. In order to understand why the Stamp Act represented a turning point in colonial feelings toward the British, we need to discuss the difference between direct and indirect taxes. The Sugar Act from 1764 was an indirect tax, which means it was collected from the merchant, or the seller. A modern comparison to this type of tax would be gasoline. Each state taxes gasoline, but your local Quick Trip figures these taxes into their sale price. So the price you see on the sign is the price you pay at the pump. You might be surprised at how much tax you pay on gasoline, but since you don't really see it when you complete the transaction, it's hard to get upset about it. A direct tax, like the Stamp Act, on the other hand, is collected from the buyer. This would be like the sales tax you pay for the candy bar inside the Quick Trip. The price on the shelf says 99 cents, but when you get to the counter, you learn you owe an additional sales tax. If one day that sales tax jumped dramatically, you would notice right away, and it might change your buying habits, or even how you felt about your government. And the Stamp Act did just that. Colonists objected to the new tax burden, citing philosophical objections that invoked the Enlightenment. This is our third big idea. The Stamp Act violated Enlightenment ideas about taxation and natural rights, and it engendered a violent backlash in the colonies. The American colonists' response to the Stamp Act revealed the extent to which Enlightenment thought had taken root in the colonies. One of the principal objections to the act was that it violated the English tradition of taxation with consent. This is kind of a quirky concept in British common law, so some explanation is needed. Taxes were common in England. In fact, the English were already paying a tax on paper products back home. But the English Bill of Rights in 1689 had established the Enlightenment principle of taxation with consent, or in other words, taxation with permission. The principle holds that the people must give the government permission to tax them. Because of this, the King or Queen of England cannot establish a tax unilaterally. It must be done by Parliament, since Parliament is the branch of the British government that represents the people. However, in 1765, the American colonies had no parliamentary representative. They therefore believed that the tax was unlawful, since they could not consent to it by way of representation. This led to the infamous Patriot rallying cry, "No taxation without representation." Now, since the colonists viewed this tax as unlawful, they interpreted it as a violation of their natural rights. More Enlightenment thinking here. Remember, John Locke had written that man's natural rights were life, liberty, and property. These were considered by many American and Englishmen alike to be fundamental and unalienable. But since money is technically property, and the colonists did not and could not consent to the tax, they considered the Stamp Act a violation of their right to property. So they responded accordingly. The colonial response to the Stamp Act included violent and non-violent methods. The peaceful wing of the opposition organized meetings and published arguments in objection to the act, and this took place throughout the colonies. In New England, towns formed committees on correspondence, gatherings in which locals discussed and organized ways to respond to the Stamp Act. The Virginia House of Burgesses passed the Virginia Stamp Act Resolution, a document that laid out the colonists' objections in no uncertain terms. Patrick Henry, who would become a leading revolutionary, was responsible for introducing the resolves for debate, and a young Thomas Jefferson was in the viewing gallery that day. The most significant peaceful response, however, was the Stamp Act Congress, the first major intercolonial convention. 9 of the 13 colonies sent delegates to the Stamp Act Congress, which drafted and issued a document called a Declaration of Rights and Grievances. The declaration included a formal request to King George that he repeal the Stamp Act. While the Stamp Act Congress is widely seen as the first successful attempt to unify the colonies, we should note here that there were no calls for independence at the Congress. The delegates still considered themselves loyal Englishmen who simply expected the same rights and protections as their brethren across the Atlantic. Elsewhere, colonial response to the Stamp Act was more extreme. Protests erupted in the streets, and an underground organization known as the Sons of Liberty took matters even further. The Sons of Liberty originated in Boston, but quickly spread to other parts of New England and the Middle Colonies. Their main objective was to take the fight directly to the British government by way of the tax collectors. The Sons of Liberty used intimidation, vandalism, and violence against British tax collectors. Their favorite method was tarring and feathering, an absolutely brutal practice which often left victims with severe burns and infections that turned fatal. Leaders of the Sons of Liberty include well-known names like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere, all of whom played central roles in the independence movement later. The colonial response to the Stamp Act caused a fever pitch in the colonies and placed enormous pressure on the Crown. In 1766, the Stamp Act was actually repealed, but recognizing that the move might be seen as a sign of weakness, the British government replaced it with the Declaratory Act, which asserted the right of the Crown to tax the colonies whenever and however it suited them. So, the Declaratory Act didn't really do anything other than send a message to the colonies that the Crown was not conceding the argument and would not be pushed around. And the British didn't wait long to test the strength of the Declaratory Act or the resolve of the colonists. The Crown's trouble with the American colonies had begun as an economic problem, but it was quickly devolving into a power struggle. This is our fourth big idea. After the Stamp Act controversy, Britain intensified its efforts to control the colonies, and the colonial responses to those efforts became increasingly volatile. Between 1766 and 1768, the British doubled down on their attempts to tax the colonies, with a series of laws known as the Townshend Revenue Acts. These were a swath of taxes placed on goods imported from England. The British hoped that the colonists would be more willing to pay taxes on imported goods, but the rhetoric that surrounded the Stamp Act had become a staple in colonial culture, and the colonies rejected the Townshend Acts just the same. They responded to the acts in two main ways. First, the protests and hostility towards British officials that had begun under the Stamp Act continued, and in some places it intensified. Second, the colonists organized boycotts of British goods, hoping to use trade as leverage. An organization of colonial women, known as the Daughters of Liberty, was established to assist in these efforts. One of Britain's most important exports in the 18th century was textiles, so the Daughters of Liberty produced homespun clothing so that colonists wouldn't have to purchase British brands. These protests and boycotts endured for years, demonstrating the resolve of the American colonists to resist taxation without representation. But the British were not content to allow unrest in the colonies to continue. Over the next several years, the Crown steadily increased the presence of British soldiers in the colonies. Remember, American colonists and British regulars had developed a rivalry during the French and Indian War, and that distaste only grew when the Redcoats were increasingly present in colonial cities, sent to enforce laws that the colonists believed were unjust. British soldiers often faced harassment, and they sometimes responded in kind. On a cold night in Boston in 1770, things turned deadly. A confrontation between a mob of colonists and British troops spun out of control. Several of the soldiers opened fire, and 5 colonists were killed. Many of the details surrounding the Boston Massacre are less than clear. Eyewitness testimony offered during the trial indicated that the colonists had cornered the soldiers, shouting at them and throwing snow, ice, rocks, and clamshells. The use of deadly force in such a situation can certainly be debated, but we do know that the colonists played a role in instigating the confrontation. However, that's not how the colonial print media depicted it. Paul Revere's famous engraving depicting the Boston Massacre went viral in the colonies, so to speak. It was widely printed and distributed in colonial newspapers. It shows the offending British officers lined up in military formation, their commander in rear of the firing line, presumably ordering them to fire in unison into a crowd of onlookers. This is almost certainly not how it happened, but this was the image ingrained in the hearts and minds of the American colonists. They were outraged. Interestingly, the soldiers were defended in court by a respected Massachusetts attorney named John Adams. Adams had become a vocal critic of the British government and its taxes, yet he poured his energies into the defense of the British soldiers, and even got them acquitted of the murder charges. Check out this clip from HBO's miniseries John Adams. In this scene, Adams is delivering his closing statement in defense of the Redcoats. Pay attention to his argument, and you'll see why he fought so hard for these soldiers.
I am for the prisoners at the bar. In the words of the Marquis of Beccaria, if by supporting the rights of mankind, I shall save from the agonies of death one unfortunate victim of tyranny or of ignorance equally fatal, his blessings will be sufficient consolation to me for the contempt of all mankind. When people are taxed without representation, they are sometimes to feel abused. And sometimes they may even rebel. But we must take care, lest, borne away by a torrent of passion, we make shipwreck of conscience. Prisoners must be judged solely upon the evidence produced against them in court and by nothing else. And the evidence we have heard speaks plainly enough, gentlemen. A sentry's post is his castle, and to attack it by English law is an illegal act. Soldiers so assaulted may defend themselves to the death. Now the people are crying, kill them, knock them down. and they're heaving sharp, cutting ice, oyster shells, clubs. What are they to do? Behave like stoic philosophers lost in apathy? Disregard these uniforms. Consider the men who wear. Consider yourselves in such a situation and judge if a reasonable man would not fear for his life. Facts are stubborn things. See, whatever our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictums of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. You see, the law, on the one hand, is inexorable to the cries and lamentations of the prisoners, but on the other hand, it is deaf as an adder to the clamors of the populace. Gentlemen of the jury, I submit to your candor and justice the prisoners and their cause.
Okay, so much cool stuff in this scene. Did you notice the rags the colonists were wearing? Almost like they were homemade clothes in the middle of a boycott of British textiles? Anyways, John Adams was easily one of the most unpopular men in the colonies after defending the soldiers in court. But he did so to send a bigger message to the colonists and to Great Britain. If indeed the colonists were to occupy the moral and philosophical high ground in their struggle with England, it was important to Adams that they not stoop to the level of the British. One of the tenets of the Stamp Act had held that violators were not given a jury trial. Adams, on the other hand, ensured that the British officers were not just given a trial, but a fair one. His message was that an enlightened society cannot let emotion, resentment, or politics get in the way of justice. By the 1770s, the British government and the American colonists had become entrenched in their positions. Each refused to give way to the other. In a final series of volleying actions, the independence movement took shape. This is our final big idea. British attempts to subdue the colonies and continued colonial protests against the British rendered the two sides irreconcilable by the mid-1770s, and the Americans voted to pursue a course of independence. Already, we've seen that the events leading up to the Declaration of Independence unfolded over many years. Both sides responded to the other, and often this resulted in deteriorating relationships between the two. The point of no return may well have been the 1773 Tea Act, which touched off a final back and forth between the colonists and the Crown. The Tea Act held that only British tea could be sold in the colonies tax-free, which damaged economic relationships with Dutch merchants. The Sons of Liberty organized an infamous response, the Boston Tea Party, which took place on December 16th. Dressed crudely as Native Americans, the protesters stormed a British ship and threw 92,000 pounds of tea overboard. The present-day value of such an act of vandalism would exceed $1 million. The British response to the Boston Tea Party was swift and sweeping. In 1774, they passed a suite of 4 punitive laws known as the Coercive Acts. In the colonies, these became known as the Intolerable Acts. The acts were designed to force the colonies into submission by increasing the British military presence and restricting colonial freedoms. Its 4 parts were as follows. First, the Boston Port Bill shut down the entire port of Boston until the colonists paid for the tea destroyed in the Boston Tea Party. Boston was built around trade at the port, so this devastated the local economy. The Massachusetts Government Act stripped the democratically elected Massachusetts Assembly of its power, giving it instead to a governor appointed directly by the Crown. The Quartering Act required American colonists to house and provide for British soldiers stationed in the colonies. And the Administration of Justice Act held that the British officials charged with a crime in the colonies would be tried in Great Britain. So essentially, the Intolerable Act stripped Bostonians of their economy, their democracy, their privacy, and their justice system. This asymmetrical response to the Boston Tea Party caught the attention of the other colonies, many of whom came to the aid of Massachusetts. In September of 1774, 12 of the 13 colonies sent delegates to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. The purpose of this Congress was to discuss and organize a response to the British incursions of liberty. The delegates, which included John and Samuel Adams from Massachusetts, as well as Patrick Henry and George Washington from Virginia, ultimately drafted a petition that they sent to King George. The document promised loyalty in exchange for the repeal of the Intolerable Acts. But the king ignored the petition, and the laws remained in force. In addition to the petition, the First Continental Congress also resolved to increase economic boycotts of British goods, and it encouraged all colonies to set up and train militias that could be ready to defend the colonies on a moment's notice. When the British learned of the military posturing taking place in the colonies, they acted to quell it. In April of 1775, new companies of British troops landed in Massachusetts and began marching towards Concord, near Boston. Their objective was to seize the colonial arsenal there, which stored weapons and supplies for the Massachusetts militia. The militia was able to mobilize, however, and the Redcoats squared off with the colonials at Lexington. The first shots of the Revolutionary War were fired there. At the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the Massachusetts militia was able to turn the Redcoats away. This was not a significant strategic victory, but it was a massive symbolic victory. It demonstrated that the colonies were capable of standing up to the British Army. And it also signaled to the other colonies that Britain was willing to use its military against its own subjects in the colonies. The outbreak of violence in Massachusetts called for a Second Continental Congress, which met in May of 1775, only a month after the skirmish at Lexington and Concord. While the colonists were enraged over the continued restrictions of liberty and the British use of force against colonial citizens, they still made a final attempt at mending the relationship. In July 1775, they drafted the Olive Branch Petition, a final attempt at reconciliation with the Crown. The document professed the colonists' loyalty and asked the king to simply open negotiations with the colonies and work towards a solution. But the king ignored the Olive Branch Petition and declared the colonists traitors before even reading it. The delegates adjourned the Congress, but asked the Virginian Thomas Jefferson to draft a document asserting the rights and independence of the American colonies, to be debated by the Congress at a later time. On July 4th, 1776, his Declaration of Independence had been approved, signed, and published. The United States of America was born, and the war for independence had officially begun. The road to the Declaration of Independence was a long one, so here's a few things to remember as we close. The Revolutionary era that began in earnest in 1763 was characterized by the gradual death of salutary neglect, as the British slowly tightened its clamps on the American colonies. Underpinning the entire movement were Enlightenment ideas. They were responsible for the vehement objections to the Stamp Act and other taxes that followed. They also fueled the colonists' desire for justice after the Boston Massacre, and their evaluation of the British government as a tyrannical one after the Intolerable Acts. The American colonists challenged authority throughout the movement by ignoring British policies like the Proclamation Line and the Currency Act. The Stamp Act Congress and the First and Second Continental Congresses were seen as traitorous by loyalists, but the American culture of asserting rights in the face of authority was flourishing. Even still, as late as 1775, and even after the first shots at Lexington were fired, the congressional delegates made attempts to reconcile their differences with the Crown. Ultimately, however, each of these attempts fell flat. Public opinion began to turn towards independence in 1776, especially after Thomas Paine published his famous pamphlet, Common Sense, which outlined the case for independence. Now, as for our big question, what about the role of violence? Certainly, the Sons of Liberty and other extreme groups gave colonists who weren't dignified lawyers or politicians an outlet for their frustration with the British. And the events most responsible for turning public opinion towards independence were indeed violent. The Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, and the battles at Lexington and Concord. But we should not discount the power of ideology in this struggle. Most colonial leaders never wavered in their desire for an enlightened, just, and peaceful America, be that via reconciliation or independence. And after independence was declared, the leaders stayed true to that ideology when they formed the first governments of the United States. In the case of the American Revolution, perhaps violence did have an important role to play, but the necessity of it remains up for debate. Next time, we'll learn that for the Americans, the hard work was only just beginning. After the Declaration of Independence was signed, they were faced with two monumental tasks: winning a war and forming a viable democracy. It will be nothing if not dramatic. See you then.